Hello, and welcome to the Sentinel Innovation and Methods Seminar Series. My name is Rishi Desai. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I will be moderating today's session. The US FDA's Sentinel system helps address questions related to safety and effectiveness of marketed medical products. Sentinel Innovation Center focuses on developing innovative methods to further advance Sentinel by leveraging new data sources, building new tools, and enhancing real-world evidence capabilities through advanced analytics. Sentinel Operations Centers maintains FDA's active risk identification and analysis, or the ARIA system. We launched this webinar series to engage experts and innovators in key areas related to Innovation Center's master plan. With that, I'm extremely pleased to announce today's speaker, Professor Sebastien Haneuse. Professor Haneuse is a Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Biostatistics at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His research agenda focuses on the design and analysis of complex observational studies, including design-based approaches to mitigate data limitations in resource-limited settings, methods for complex missing data in EHR-based studies, and methods for the analysis of semi-competing risk data. From a substantive perspective, he has collaborated in a wide range of scientific domains, including breast cancer screening, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, HIV/AIDS, bariatric surgery, diabetes, childhood and adult obesity, LGBTQ health, and hospital profiling. The title of his presentation today is Addressing Missing Data in Comparative Effectiveness Research Using EHR Data. As you might imagine, this is of extreme relevance to the Sentinel program as it thinks more about incorporating additional EHR-based data assets into the Sentinel infrastructure. So before we get started, I would like to mention that your lines are muted. If you would like to pose a question, please type it in the Zoom question and answer feature, and we will answer all the questions at the end of this session. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be made available through our webpage, which is sentinelinitiative.org. Without further ado, I will let Dr. Haneuse take over at this point. And again, thank him very much for joining us today.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So I'm going to share my screen with the talk. All right. Just to confirm, Rishi, can you just make sure that you guys can all see this?
Yes, we can see the PDF.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, well, thank you, Rishi, for inviting me to come and give this talk. I'm very happy to be here, and just want to say also thank you to Shamika for all of the administrative pieces and getting us all in the same room together. So I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done with a number of colleagues over the years in trying to address missing data in comparative effectiveness research using electronic health records. In a previous life, before I was in Boston, I was an investigator, what was Group Health Cooperative, the Group Health Research Institute. And when I was there, engaged in sort of a long-term that continued when I moved to Boston research agenda involving looking at long-term outcomes following bariatric surgery. So I thought I'd set the stage here a little bit with some of that work, just to give you a sense of how I got to the point where I'm interested in dealing with, in sort of investigating and developing methods. So folks may know, I mean, obviously type 2 diabetes is a huge issue worldwide. And the initial sort of framing of the work was an understanding that sustained metabolic control is difficult through first-line treatment options, lifestyle modifications, physical activity, and pharmacotherapy. And again, this was like 10 plus years ago, but bariatric surgery was increasingly being sort of viewed as a safe and effective alternative to these types of conventional therapies, ultimately receiving an endorsement by the American Diabetes Association. But and there have been some trials, but most of those trials had focused on short-term outcomes, and interest lay with better understanding long-term outcomes, including comparing surgery versus conventional therapies, as well as different procedures. Folks may know there are at least 3 major bariatric procedures, with the most recently developed vertical sleeve gastrectomy. And so understanding with this backdrop, there are different options that folks have, both do you undergo bariatric surgery, and then what procedure do you undergo? And that gave rise to a collaboration over about a 10-year period that used electronic health records data from 3 Kaiser Permanente healthcare systems. So there's KP Washington, formerly Group Health Cooperative, where I was an investigator, and then coupled with KP Northern California and Southern California. And we ended up getting 2 NIH-funded R01s to use these electronic health records that gave rise to a bunch of different publications looking at various long-term outcomes, different comparisons, the PROMISE study and the durable study. One of those I just want to highlight, just to give you a sense again of like this flavor for helping us sort of motivate some of the work that we've been interested in, is study published in 2020, looking at weight outcomes of sleeve gastrectomy and gastric bypass compared to non-surgical treatment. This was a matched cohort study. So the idea is that we identified around 30,000 bariatric cases in the KP systems, and then we matched them to roughly 3 per bariatric case non-cases. So these are the non-surgical group. And we looked at weight trajectories over the course of up to, between 5 and 10 years following surgery. And there's sort of a lot of detail there. You can see these sort of non-linear weight trajectories for folks who underwent bariatric surgery, and there's a lot of complexity involved. The analyses ended up being based on a hierarchical linear mixed model with normally distributed random effects. I think this study, I sort of put it here in part to help exemplify what I suspect most people know, like the well-advertised benefits of using electronic health records. You've got very large populations. I mean, moving forward, I suspect we're not going to be doing studies of 120,000 individuals, looking at long-term 10+ years of outcomes following bariatric surgery. But we have that readily available to us. We've got large populations, long time periods, huge amount of information that's readily accessible. I say that I should probably put that in quotes, and relatively cheap to obtain. So lots and lots of well-advertised benefits. They're, of course, though, electronic health records are not really collected for research purposes. They're there primarily to facilitate improved clinical care and then and tracking and processing of claims. So we're using these data that exist for alternative purposes, specifically for research purposes. And I think it's reasonable to ask, are those data that we're getting comparable in scope and quality to the data that we would have collected had we engaged in a dedicated research agenda that, where we recruit a bunch of people and we follow them over time and we're deciding what we want to measure and when. There are many challenges using electronic health records, and most of these are not new and manifest in more, let's say, traditional contexts. And of course, there is a massive biostatistics and epidemiologic methods literature, along with lots and lots of software that has been implemented that we could appeal to. We're saying, oh, we got this electronic health records. We got lots and lots of tools at our disposal. And the query then becomes, well, if we understand that there are these challenges associated with electronic health records, can we just off the shelf use existing methods to do the analyses? And that's sort of an important question, and can sort of frame an initial thought around that question with, let's say, a hypothetical, let's say we were going to do a de novo hypothetical study looking at sort of bariatric surgery outcomes in the 2 years post-surgery. So these are actual data from 6 patients in durable. So these were individuals who underwent bariatric surgery. And to orient you, in each instance, we've got the x-axis is time since surgery. So 0 is the time of surgery, and this is the vertical black line. We're sort of just looking forward 2 years and back 6 months. And then the blue dots are BMI measurements on the right-hand scale, and the red plus signs are hemoglobin A1C measurements where the axis is on the left-hand side. And the key message and the key takeaway is that the data is really complex. The vertical gray lines are instances where patients had an interaction with the healthcare system. And so you can see, for example, there are a number of instances where an individual had an interaction with the healthcare system that did not generate a measurement. So you wonder why that's possibly the case. Of course, like people are not coming in at exactly the same times. There are points in time where there's a lot of activity, followed by periods where there's no activity, followed by, and you can imagine lots of different scenarios for that. Some individuals have intense interactions with the healthcare system throughout this period, others sporadic. And then you have to contend with the fact that if you're interested in 2-year outcomes, there are some individuals who disenroll from the health plan prior to that time point, and that adds sort of an additional layer of complexity. So we've got all of this complexity at play, and again, sort of just querying, can we use existing methods to address these various challenges? And my sense is that much of the time, these existing standard methods that we may have learned in our sort of introductory courses to biostatistics will in one way or another be either inadequate or unsatisfactory. And in particular, they generally fail to acknowledge the scale, complexity, and heterogeneity of EHR data. I mean, I've just given you 6 examples, and we had a study involving 30,000 of these patients. Any particular scenario that you can imagine, I'm sure that we could find a patient that had that. The other thing that's a little bit more subtle is that when we see new methods that are being developed, or even old methods, they're typically developed through the lens of focusing on a single challenge, in particular in isolation of any other potential challenge. You'll read statistics papers or epi papers, and I'll be like, okay, here we're going to focus solely on missing data, and to the sort of essentially being agnostic to all of these other things like confounding and measurement error, and yet, of course, in an electronic health record study, these things are all going to be manifesting simultaneously. So there is an emerging literature on statistical methods that are specifically tailored to research in the EHR-based setting. Much, if not most of that, is towards methods for dealing with confounding bias. I think in an observational setting, I think most folks sort of would identify confounding as sort of the key challenge. And so you've got sort of relatively recently developed methods like high-dimensional propensity scores that are tailored towards that specific setting. And then there are some other areas that have received some attention. Linkage of records across databases is a unique challenge. And then, the use of natural language processing for text-based notes, it's also, there's a good amount of research that's been involved. The focus of our work, the folks that I've worked with over the last 6 or 7 years, has really been on what I think is a relatively underappreciated problem, and that's the potential for selection bias due to missing data. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by selection bias in a moment, but I think it's worth sort of stepping back and saying, well, how did we handle missing data in the Arterburn paper that I mentioned a little earlier? And it really involved sort of combining a couple of strategies that probably relatively standard. So one of them is just we used exclusion. There were some individuals, I mean, we had a study that involved 30,000 individuals, and there were some who had missing preoperative BMI data. So if you're looking at BMI change, obviously you need the preoperative value to be able to look at change. And those individuals, we ended up deciding to exclude them. But then there were also a whole range of other variables that we needed for the adjustment of confounding in particular, and there we used multiple imputation by chained equations. We can litigate those particular decisions, but my point is, I think they're probably pretty reasonable. Are they optimal? Are they the best? I'm not 100% sure. Probably not. But they seem reasonable, but also pretty ad hoc. We had to make decisions and then sort of move forward with those. But then also when we take a closer look at what was done, and I was the lead statistician on these papers, so I'm more than fine admitting this, it wasn't really clear what assumptions about the missing data this particular strategy invoked. And as I'm going to sort of emphasize throughout the talk, assumptions that we make about the missing data and the processes that gave rise to missingness or complete data are really critical in order to, they're critical in the sense that, without them, the validity, the generalizability of our results is compromised. So what do I mean by selection bias? Selection bias arises when the study subsample used in the analyses is not representative in some way of the study population to whom we intend to generalize the results. So the idea is we've got this patient population that we're interested in. Maybe we've identified them on the basis of select inclusion-exclusion criteria. Then we go to the data and we're like, okay, here is the information that we have at our disposal. And then it turns out that some subsample has complete data. And then the query is, well, if we did an analysis based upon the study subsample, would we be able to generalize, back to the study population that we care about? So selection bias, in this instance, speaks to external generalizability or lack thereof. And it's a distinct phenomenon, even though I think sometimes treatment selection bias is sort of conflated with confounding bias, that often labels that are used synonymously. Here, I'm trying to be very specific in saying that selection bias in the way that I'm thinking about it is a distinct phenomenon from confounding bias, which speaks to internal validity. So in some cases, I think the potential for selection bias may end up being evident. So, as an example, is complete case analysis. If we were to conduct a complete case analysis where we just exclude everybody who has any missing data, the appeal of that particular path forward, which is pervasive, is that it's the path of least resistance. We basically exclude everybody, and then we pretend like the sample that we end up with is essentially a random sample from the population that we're interested in. And so you're not actually really addressing the missing data, you're sort of sweeping it under the rug in many ways. But yeah, I mean, at that point, by sweeping the missing data under the rug, you have to step back and think, well, how does that affect generalizability? And it really depends upon who it was that had complete data, and in particular, why some individuals had complete data and others not. And this really does ultimately speak to missing data assumptions. I mean, in some settings, though, it may not be clear how we characterize individuals as having complete data or not. I mean, if all we're looking at is what's going on between baseline and 2 years, that's relatively straightforward, because you either need a measurement at baseline, or you need a measurement at baseline and at 2 years, and if you don't have either of those, then you could argue it's not complete. But what if we were interested in characterizing weight loss trajectories in the 2-year window following bariatric surgery? So something akin to, this type of figure. They're trying to understand not just what's going on at a single time point, but what's going on over time. And then that's our goal, which I think is a reasonable goal in the same vein as the Arterburn paper. But then this is the data that we have at our disposal. And it's really all over the place. What does complete data in relation to that particular question mean, especially when you've got issues around some people have healthcare interactions, but for some reason they didn't have a weight measurement taken. Other people are enrolled, but have almost a year-long window where they don't have any interaction and as such no weight measurements. And then there are other people who disenroll beforehand. So we've got lots of missing data, lots of different missing data patterns here that are pretty reasonable in what we might see, but very distinct phenomena coming along and very complex data structures. So, instead of going down that path of saying we're just going to restrict our analyses to those with complete data, understanding that sometimes it's not that easy to do that. An alternative would be to say, well, let's not worry about that type of restriction, but let's just try to make the most of the available data. So for example, we could take the information that we have here, and we could say, we're just going to try to use all of these blue dots as best as we possibly can. And one way of doing that would be to, say, fit a hierarchical model as a function of time, just like we did in the Annals of Surgery paper. And the appeal of that is that you get to use all of this information, and so none of it, there's like patients for whom there is quote unquote incomplete information, whatever that means, don't get lost. And that's appealing. We're not throwing away information, but an important drawback here is that the model is likely going to be large and pretty complex, as it was in our paper. And that in turn can result in challenges in relation to specifying the model. How do we capture these unique patterns? There are ways of doing that, but we need to be careful about how we do that. we need to be careful about how we specify these things, because sometimes, the results can be quite sensitive to choices that you make, including not just structural choices around the trajectory, but also things like the distribution of the random effects. Sometimes that can have an impact. So one drawback is that you need to, if you want to use all of the information, you got to do something pretty complicated. And that complicated model probably involves a whole bunch of assumptions that are not always transparent, including what assumptions we're making about the missing data. If my philosophy here is I'm just going to use all of this, I'm again essentially sweeping the missing data issue under the rug by not addressing it and just sort of putting in front of us a complicated model. So either way, there's some sort of unsatisfactory elements to either of these. And of course, there are some intermediate options that involve arguably an almost infinite number of ad hoc approaches. You could employ involving sort of restriction of one kind. You could use inverse probability weighting. You could use multiple imputation like I did. And then some of you may be familiar with some more recently developed methods, doubly robust methods and pattern mixture models are not so much recent, but probably not as widely used as some of these others. But they're all pretty well established in the statistical literature. But even here, it's still not always obvious how to apply these relatively standard methods, because again, they're often developed in idealized settings where missing data is the only issue at hand. And again, you're sort of ad hoc mixing different methods, each of which have their own sets of assumptions. And I think that this doesn't lend itself to transparency in a way that I think we need to have when we're using electronic health records. So with this backdrop, I'm not going to pretend we've covered all of the bases, but I think the rest of the talk is going to involve providing an overview of some progress that we've made in a number of different directions. So the first of these is this idea of modularizing the data provenance. So what do I mean by that? So I'm going to take a somewhat simplified scenario, one that I've sort of mentioned already. I'm going to compare vertical sleeve gastrectomy to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass on the basis of 2-year weight loss using electronic health records. So some of you may be familiar with the causal inference literature, the statistical literature, and even the sort of the epi literature. There's going to be a little notation here. I understand that not everybody will be able to get through this, but hopefully it'll still be reasonable. A is an indicator of treatment. So you either, actually these two should be switched around. So it should be vertical sleeve gastrectomy as a 1. And then the outcome is weight change. And then acknowledging that this is an observational study, I'm going to presuppose that we've done the work up front to, understanding how people make decisions between these two different procedures and the sort of what factors are associated with the outcomes, that we've got a set of factors, let's say L, that is sufficient for the control of confounding. So I'm not going to sort of litigate that. There are a lot of different issues involved there, but then I'm going to assume we've done that work. And from that, we could conceive of getting a random sample from the electronic health record, or at least conceiving of the electronic health record as being a random sample. And I'm going to say the full data would consist of an IID sample with information on all of these key components. We've got the treatment indicator, the outcome, and then the confounders. And I'm going to presuppose that we know what we would do had we had access to the full data. So if we had complete data, no missing data, then we kind of know what we were going to do. And it may be some regression, it may be something else. But at that point, however, we find ourselves in a specific scenario where perhaps A and L are always observed, but that Y is only sometimes observed. So admittedly, this is a simplified scenario. Like I said a few slides ago, we haven't covered all of the bases, but we're sort of working to make progress. And this is a first step, I think. So when you're in a setting where you've got some people have got complete data and others not, we often introduce an indicator here, a 0-1 indicator R, that says, do you have complete data on the outcome or not? And those individuals for whom we observe the outcome, it's a 1, and otherwise it's a 0. So for folks who are familiar with inverse probability weighting, we would build a model for R and use the fitted values as weights. So I'm going to refer to this collection of factors as the incomplete data. So what's going on here? Again, I'm assuming A and L are observed on everyone. Of course, I know for everybody whether or not Y is observed, but I only observe Y on those folks where R is equal to 1. So you observe R, I get to see your Y. If R is equal to 0, we don't get to see anything, just putting a 0 here as a placeholder. So this is a way of concisely indicating sort of the incomplete data that we're faced with. And what we could do here is we could say, okay, we've got incomplete data. We could, combine that with whatever, I'm presupposing we knew what we were going to do had we had full data, and we would take that approach with some other approach for quote unquote dealing with the missing data. So one thing you could do is you could say, oh, I'm going to use multiple imputation. I'm going to fill in all of the missing Ys, and then I'm going to go ahead and do whatever I was going to do anyway. So that's one way forward. If you do that, in addition to sort of the usual causal assumptions, I'm going to go over those a bit later on: consistency, positivity, no unmeasured confounding. The validity of whatever you did here would hinge on a missing at random assumption. So here I've got a little notation, and the idea here is like, this is, telling me whether or not I observe the outcome is independent of or unrelated to the value itself, given all of these other factors. So intuitively, whether a value is missing is unrelated to the value itself. So MAR would rule out scenarios where patients who do poorly are less likely to disenroll from the health plan. Saying, oh yeah, we didn't observe you, and once we know L and Y, it has nothing to do with the underlying value of Y. So this may or may not be a strong assumption, and we have to assess it. And I think the way in which it's typically assessed would be to say, okay, some people have got missing data. Let's conceive of some mechanism that's driving whether or not people have complete data. And we'll try to understand that mechanism. And then what's critical is I try to identify factors that are relevant to that mechanism. And then we just hope that we've got all of those factors measured. And then if we do have all of these factors measured, then we can perform some form of adjustment. Operationally, I think what we do is we say, oh, here we've got individuals, there's a new treatment episode. They either have complete data or incomplete data. And I'm trying to understand who ends up over here and why. Like, what are the factors that determine whether or not an individual gets over here? And we might label this as I think this is operationally how folks typically go about thinking about missing data. You either have missing data, you either have incomplete data, or you have complete data. So we might label this a single mechanism approach because it's boiling everything down to this one indicator. You either have complete data or not. But my sense is that typically fails to recognize, the complexity of most clinical contexts. Whether or not we observe stuff in the EHR is likely, involves an interplay among decisions that are made by patients and their providers, and sometimes even the healthcare system. So there are a lot of moving parts. As we sort of think about information longitudinally, whether we observe a weight measurement at baseline versus at 2 years down the road may depend upon different factors, and in particular factors that change over time. This doesn't really acknowledge sort of heterogeneity within and between healthcare systems. And then it doesn't acknowledge that the motivation and incentives for data collection are not really research-oriented. We're trying to sort of shoehorn research-oriented ideas into a much more complex scenario. And so one of the ideas that we've come up with is to apply, consider and then apply these 3 key principles. So folks may be familiar with the emulating target trials framework of Miguel Hernan and his colleagues at the School of Public Health. This follows very much in that vein, but instead of thinking about emulating a randomized trial and worrying primarily about confounding, here I'm sort of trying to use that way of thinking to think about missing data. selection bias. So to that end, there are sort of three key principles. One is specify the structure of the data that would have been collected had the opportunity to conduct an ideal study been an option. And then secondly, to sort of frame the task of selection bias with the question, what data are observed and why? And that is sometimes referred to as the data provenance. And as we'll see, I think that helps with sort of considering and articulating and clarifying missing data assumptions. And then after that, we've got some statistical methods. So what do I mean by consideration of an ideal study? I really sort of think about this through the lens of, what would we do if we were sitting down and we were designing a study? Like we were going to write a grant proposal and we were going to recruit a bunch of people and we were going to follow them in time. And I think in going through that process, we would have to identify all variables that would have been collected had we had the opportunity to, and then indicate the timing of those measurements. So just going briefly back to, if we were looking to do a prospective study of weight outcomes in the first 2 years, we would, we would have to say, like, when are we measuring these individuals? I think that's something that we would have to include as part of the grant proposal, and the granularity with which we specify when we measure individuals provides a sense of how fine our assessment can be of this trajectory. If we're only measuring things every year, we can at most get a coarse assessment. But if we're measuring things every day, we get a very fine assessment. And then, of course, there are some practical considerations where we would probably go for somewhere in between. But all of that is to say, this is just hypothetical, right? We can do this. We're at a point where we know the electronic health record is out there. We can sort of, we can go through that process as if we were writing a grant. And how we go about doing that depends upon what the scientific goals are. But usually I think that it's possible to do this. It really doesn't rely on any skills other than what we would need to be able to write a grant. So a lot of details here that I'm glossing over, but I'm assuming that we can do that we can write down what we might view as the ideal study. And then once we've got that, I think what's clear at that point is that it renders meaningful the notions of complete data and missing data. It's like, oh, I know exactly that I want to get weight measurements every 6 months. So now if somebody has weight measurements at each 6-month mark, let's say plus minus some window, then they have complete data, and otherwise they have missing data in some capacity. And then I can, with that, I can then say, I've got all of these different missing data patterns. And I can begin to sort of try to understand, why is it that some people have got complete data and why is it that some people have got missing data of a particular form? And you could, so any given data element, whether or not it's observed, could depend upon a whole range of different things, including decisions that are made by the patient, their providers, the healthcare system. It may also be that covariates have differential impacts on different decisions. So, your smoking status at baseline may have some impact on certain decisions, but no impact on other decisions. And with that, you can begin to build up a story of why it is that some people have got complete data and others not. And the general idea here is to break down this task of characterizing probably a complex process into a series of, let's say, manageable sub-mechanisms. So just to sort of illustrate, we've got this running example. We're interested in BMI at 2 years, or let's say weight at 2 years. Sorry, there's a typo here. So in order to get complete weight data, obviously you need a measurement at the time of surgery, or let's say somewhere close to it. You need to be actively enrolled at 2 years. I mean, if you've been disenrolled, then of course, we're not going to have any BMI measurements. And then at that 2-year mark, we need to have an encounter that occurred during which BMI was recorded. So you could sort of, instead of having this single mechanism, you either have complete data or not, we can break it up into these sub-mechanisms. Oh, in order to have complete data, you needed to have had complete baseline information. You needed to be enrolled. You needed to have the measurement at 5 years. And these are 3 distinct sub-mechanisms. And for each of those sub-mechanisms, you could begin to query, what factors are relevant to each of these things. And it may be that there are some factors that are relevant to the third one that you don't collect. but those factors, for example, it may be that smoking information at 5 years or 2 years, sorry, is the thing that's most pertinent as to what's going on here, but for some reason we don't collect good smoking information. Maybe we have it at baseline because everybody who has bariatric surgery, we find out whether or not they're smokers. So this idea, you know, I've broken up this, modularized the missingness, you know, it can really go beyond these types of sub-mechanisms. We might be interested in completeness at other time points, completeness in other variables, confounders. You know, you might apply that set of ideas to receipt of care outside of the system. There may be different types of encounter. You know, at Kaiser Washington, when I left, they were just beginning to roll out in earnest secure messaging. And then, of course, nowadays with the pandemic, you know, virtual encounters are becoming increasingly common. But, you know, and of course, when you have I had a virtual encounter with my PCP a couple months ago, and of course, I didn't have my weight measurement at that time when I normally would. But then also perhaps more subtle things, like especially when you're looking at long windows, there are changes in measurement standards or infrastructure that render certain types of outcomes missing just because the coding doesn't translate. So there are lots of ways in which we could sort of think about why does somebody have missing data? Why does somebody have complete data, and thinking about all of the components to it. So, you know, moving forward, we've got this proposed strategy of modularizing the missing data. I think it provides a reasonably scalable framework within which you can break stuff into smaller pieces that are perhaps more manageably handled, in particular in relation to thinking about assumptions, factors that are relevant to each of those decisions, and then eventually statistical methods. And just sort of one page on statistical methods, just to highlight some of the stuff that some of my sort of colleagues have done. Sarah Pesco, who's now at Duke, she was using inverse probability weighting. She was saying, oh yeah, let's acknowledge that there are these 3 sub-mechanisms. Each of these, you know, you had to have a 1 to get all the way down to the bottom. So I'm just going to build a series of logistic regression models, one for this guy, one for this guy, one for this guy, and then I can combine all of those things as an overall weight to use to do inverse probability weighting at the end of the day, and hopefully mitigate the different types of missingness, biases due to missingness. And then there's another previous colleague, or at least a current colleague, but previously a student, Tony Tuitai, his PhD, said, well, some of these, you know, we could actually use imputation. So maybe we would impute missing baseline information. If they're disenrolled, it's not really, doesn't really lend itself to imputation. To imputation, maybe we would use inverse probability weighting to deal with the disenrollment mechanism. But then among those who remain enrolled, maybe we would use imputation again. So these refers to these as blended analyses, where you're like, okay, we've broken it down, and it turns out we have options as to how to deal with these separate and distinct sub-mechanisms. I'm happy to send you some information if you want a little bit more detail there. I'm going to sort of forge ahead with kind of some of the more recent work, trying to bridge sort of the missing data with ideas of causal inference, at least sort of modern causal inference. So folks may be familiar with the counterfactual framework that underpins modern causal inference. The idea here is we can conceive of the outcome, the counterfactual outcome YA, that is the outcome that would be observed had, possibly contrary to the fact, treatment being set to a particular treatment A. So for each of the bariatric, in the bariatric surgery example that I've been using as a running example, you know, there are 2 treatment choices. We can conceive of the outcome had an individual undergone one procedure versus the outcome had they undergone the other procedure, and then we might define the average treatment effect as being kind of the difference in the average outcomes between those 2 scenarios. So one scenario where everybody gets, the way this is coded, a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass versus where everybody gets a vertical sleeve gastrectomy. So this is a pretty standard estimand. It's a pretty standard target that we are going for in the causal inference. And folks may be familiar with this. Of course, in order to make progress, you have to formally invoke a set of assumptions. I'm not going to go through the details, but consistency, positivity, and known measured confounding. And then I'm going to say, oh yeah, we've got our full data. So this is the same full data that we had before. We've got the confounders, treatment, and outcome. And then we've got a whole bunch of well-established methods. We've got the G formula, we've got propensity score-based estimation, and then we've got augmented inverse probability weighting. And if folks want a review of all of these ideas, I'd encourage you to go to the Causal Inference book, What If by Miguel Hernan and Jenny Robbins. And so, yeah, there's like a whole huge literature out there that's like growing by the minute, it seems. And so there's all of this literature on causal inference, and then there's all of this sort of parallel literature for missing data. But interestingly, there's very little that's done at the intersection of the two, where you're trying to deal with these two issues simultaneously. Of course, we've got these ad hoc methods that I presented earlier, but our broad goals are to say, what can we do to establish methods that simultaneously address confounding and selection bias in a wide range of hopefully realistic settings that have desirable properties. So in particular, where assumptions are clear, where we've got optimal statistical efficiency, and then some robustness properties would be nice. And we've made progress in a number of scenarios. Here I'm going to present some work that we've done where the outcome data are potentially missing, not at random, so informative missingness. So what do I mean by that? Again, suppose we find ourselves at the design stage, perhaps at a point where we're developing a proposal or a grant, and we know we're going to use the electronic health record, but the possibility has been raised that the missing outcome data are missing, not at random. So they're missing possibly because of what their values are. And maybe this is something that's come up in a discussion among the collaborators, or maybe, we submitted the grant and we got some review or feedback. And a critique was that, we need to worry about whether or not the outcome data are missing, not at random. And of course, if it truly is the case that the outcome data are missing, not at random, then if we just forged ahead, assuming missing at random, then our results would be compromised and biased. And what's really challenging about missing not at random is that it's not testable, at least not typically. And so what typically happens is that folks propose sensitivity analyses. But as with most sensitivity analyses, the problem is that there are no sort of guarantees that concrete conclusions will emerge. And in one way, you could think, oh, I've got these sensitivity analyses. I'm going to take this sensitivity parameter. I'm going to perturb it, and I'm going to look to see whether or not that changes stuff. Sometimes it doesn't change things. Sometimes it changes a lot. And my sense in that instance is that it's generally unsatisfying because we don't know what to believe. Although, frankly, that might not be a bad thing. I think that there is sensitivity indicates it's a marker of the fact that you don't have the data that you wish you had. So sensitivity analysis is really a post hoc solution, but I've been specific to frame where we are as being at the design stage. And so I'll put forward an alternative philosophy that is to engage in additional data collection efforts. So the idea here is to preemptively tailor these efforts to be able to hopefully at least partially move beyond missing not at random. So there is this potential that it's missing not at random. We're not quite sure. Let's collect some data that will help us with that. And there is a rich literature on the design and analysis of studies that involve collection of additional information. I'm sure everybody is familiar with case control studies when you've got the outcome is binary, but you've also got case cohort studies in survival outcomes, time to event outcomes, and then sort of extensions of both of those things to phase studies. Most of the time, I think when we're entertaining these additional data collection effort designs, it's because there's some particular variable that's not readily available or it's expensive to ascertain. And I also think that most of the time, concern lies with mitigation of confounding bias or misclassification measurement error. So, what we're doing is we're thinking, well, can we use some of these, this philosophy in the context of trying to deal with missing data? And so the premise then is we've got resources, or at least maybe we set aside resources in the budget of our grant with which the otherwise missing outcome information is obtained on at least subsample of patients for whom they're initially missing. And, I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but maybe we would do, in some instances, it may be reasonable to do that via a detailed chart review. In other instances, maybe with a follow-up survey. In some instances, it might not be possible. We actually did go through this process. This paper was published a couple of years ago where we actually did a follow-up survey at KP Washington, where we went back and we had a look at patients who'd undergone bariatric surgery in 2013-14. And then at the 5-year anniversary, we sort of conducted a survey, tried to, among individuals who had disenrolled. There's a lot more detail to it in this paper if you're interested in. But the point is that it's possible. The point is that this was part, doing this survey was actually part of one of the grant proposals that we submitted. So how does that work? We've got this study population. Some individuals, we have complete information on their outcome. Others we don't at the outset, and among those individuals, we're going to collect, we're going to survey them and in an effort to try to get complete information on them as well. So we've got the original full complete data. We've got, sorry, the original full data. We've got the incomplete data that's initially available to us in the EHR. And then we've got what we were referring to as the final observed data, which involves, knowing the outcome on everybody who we had it originally and everybody who makes it into the subsample via the double sampling. So, key is that we do have this additional information. But as with just about everything, I've been hammering folks over the head with assumptions. There are additional assumptions that are needed. So one of them is this assumption of non-informative double sampling. So the idea is like, how is it that some people are subsampled over here and others not? And the idea is, we've got essentially a missing at random assumption for the sampling indicator. And the idea is, whoever makes it into the subsample, that they made it into the subsample is independent of their value of Y. And then we also need somewhat more technical, this positivity assumption, where essentially saying for everyone for whom their outcome was initially missing has a chance of being selected. These are assumptions that we can query. But if we have those assumptions in place, like after collecting the data, after conducting the double sampling, we have a whole wide range of analysis strategies that can be employed. We've got the original data that was obtained through the electronic health record. We've also got this new data. So, different analysis strategies would use those data in different ways. There'd be different kinds of assumptions that we might be willing to make, including whether the original data was missing at random in retrospect. And then it turns out, I'm not going to get into the details of it, there are different types of estimators that we could employ. So we actually, given access to this new data, all of this is to say we have a lot of options at our disposal. So as long as you can buy into that premise, trying to be mindful of time here without going into a lot of details, it opens up the door to a wide range of things, including trying to use this new data to assess the missing not at random assumption, which ostensibly, at the outset at least, was not testable. So, I think a key benefit of going down this path, of adopting this philosophy, is actually there are some things that now you can test. And in doing that test, we've developed an adaptive estimator that says, well, maybe we can use that information to decide whether or not we should forge ahead, assuming missing not at random actually holds or missing at random. So a lot of details there. I'm more than happy to share information if you're interested. Conclude with a couple of points here, the sort of key ideas. I think I've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully, though, I've convinced you that at least in some instances, EHR-based settings, missing data may not be business as usual. To be honest, I think sometimes it may be perfectly fine, but not always. And I think it's important and worth thinking about it up front. sort of another key idea is modularization of the data provenance. And here the idea is to sort of thinking about the processes by which people have complete data in the electronic health record. It's likely a combination of a lot of different things. And breaking those things apart and querying them individually, I think is wise and can help with better aligning the analyses with the complexity of the data. And then there may be at some points where there's the strong potential for the dates to be missing not at random. And rather than throwing your hands up in the air or doing sensitivity analyses that can be unsatisfying, I think double sampling is probably a means, if not the only means, to really be able to move beyond that. Most of the time when I've given this talk, last sort of comment, folks are really interested in this double sampling. How do we go about doing it? How do we contact patients post hoc? How do we know that there's not recall bias? These are all phenomena that sort of practical issues that I think are very legitimate and things that we would need to be worried about. And I think we're sort of muddling our way through trying to come up with guidelines as to when going down this path would be feasible and others not. My sense, though, is this is really sort of the key message at the end is, my sense is that if we're thinking about all of this at the design stage, something that we would have to do if we were, proactively writing a grant to collect information, then maybe we can do something about it. Maybe it's not going to be the solution to all problems. But I think that if we put as much thought into missing data upfront as we typically do for confounding, there's a lot to be done. And moreover, you can plan to devote resources to it. And I think that will lend itself to success, hopefully. So those are the key things. Thank you again, Rishi. I think we got like 5 or 10 minutes to answer any questions that have come up.
Thank you. That was excellent. Congrats on all the great work. That's sure to inform a lot of the empirical investigations moving forward. So thank you for sharing that with us. I already see there are many questions that are rolling in. So we can start with one from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do you see erroneous values in this framework? Is it same as missing data, or is it something that is that needs to be treated differently? For example, implausible BMIs.
Yeah, I mean, I would refer to erroneous, I guess, can mean lots of different things. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, like you got a BMI of 600, probably not real. But then you may have an individual who goes from a BMI of like 45 one day to 25 the next week, and it seems implausible. So there's sort of issues there that it's not quite the same as missing data. I would view it as a measurement error issue. And there's a whole parallel literature. Folks are interested. Brian Shepard at Vanderbilt, and then Pam Shaw at Group Health. They do a lot of this stuff. They're old colleagues of mine, but they do a lot of that stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful. Another question from Dr. Jesse Berlin is around thresholds for amount of missing data. Do you see any useful rule of thumb for beyond which one can lose confidence in conclusions based on the analysis?
I don't know. Jesse's always asking the difficult questions. I don't know. I have to admit, I don't believe in prescription in that way. I don't believe in rules of thumb. It just depends, depends upon sort of the mechanisms at play. If you could end up with a lot of missing data and it's all perfectly fine, and the issue is more about statistical efficiency rather than bias. So I don't know, and it really depends. It's sort of unsatisfying answer, I'm afraid. Yeah.
No, and also an honest one. So really appreciate this. Thank you. There is a slightly more technical question from Dr. Yannick Weber-Pals, who was wondering whether there are some principles that you use to combine the split points of your proposed mechanism, and how do you arrive at a conclusion of the missingness at random after combining information from various nodes?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The split points. So, I think what's interesting, and we haven't gotten anywhere near there, is, as we go through each of these 3 sub-mechanisms, so to get to this point, I think you had to have gone through that ideal study design step. So hopefully that informed how you got to here. But then when you get to here, you may feel the missing at random assumption may hold for each of these individually. I think that's the point, actually, is that you can then query missingness at random individually here. And then I suppose in totality, then you could sort of make some argument that overall missing at random holds. But I think when you break it down into these pieces, I don't really think of it anymore as like one missing at random holding or not. It's more, here are the different mechanisms, and I'm going to query each one individually. A benefit of going down this path is you may decide, depending upon your understanding of these mechanisms, that, you know, maybe R1 and R2, you have all of the things that are relevant, like you have them all measured. And you may in that moment argue missing at random is plausible. But the disenrollment piece, maybe you're like, that one's a little tricky because I don't really know. And it may be that this particular submechanism, you're actually worried about missing not at random. You feel it's plausible for these, but not this one, let's say. And at that point, you can tailor whatever you want to do for the missing not at random, specifically in relation to this submechanism. Be it sensitivity analyses, even though they're unsatisfying, or, you know, maybe this additional data collection stuff is a path forward. But at least then it helps you sort of focus in on what the real issue is. If otherwise you're sort of this big, broad, nebulous, either it doesn't hold or it doesn't, or it does. And I think the benefit of this is it helps you focus. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. There is an additional question on the comment that you were just making around disenrollment. So someone, an anonymous attendee asks, the mechanism may be different if someone enrolled right away versus someone enrolled close to that 5-year mark. So how do you differentiate between these types of, I guess, differential and disenrollment patterns in your general framework?
Yeah, I mean, it's great. It's a good question, because one of the good things about enrollment as or disenrollment as you would be modeling disenrollment, right? And so you could say, well, I'm going to model disenrollment at 5 years. Yes, no, maybe I'll do a logistic regression. You could also model, if you think that you could model it as a time to event outcome, you know, where you've got like disenrollment is a time to event outcome. And yeah, it may be that stuff that's going on early on in the timescale is different than what's going on later on in the timescale. And you've just got all of the survival analysis stuff out there in the world that will help you with that. And then at the end of it, you compute a probability of just, you know, which is essentially the probability of survival, you know, remaining enrolled at 5 years.
That's great, thanks. So there's one more question which is related to specific type of information that may be missing. So the question is from Yi Li, who asks, if for drug prescriptions, the in-hospital administrations sometimes may not be captured, and this mechanism is not missing at random. For specific things like this, is there any way to deal with this type of missing data?
Well, first of all, I don't know if this is Yi Li at Michigan, but if it is, hello. And if it's not, I'm sorry, maybe I'll pass across. Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure if the question is saying is not available at all, or if it's just that it's sometimes available, but it's missing not at random. I guess if it's sometimes available and it's missing, and it's, you know, you're worried about whether or not it's missing not at random, I don't know, maybe there's a mechanism by which you could try to collect information post hoc about it. You know, the whole double sampling thing, it's not a universal solution, because there are sometimes where it's just not possible to do. And then I think you'd have to go and do the sensitivity analyses. If it's the case that all of that information is completely missing, maybe you can still do some subsampling to try to ascertain it, but now it's not so much about, it's sort of inherently something that's not collected and you're trying to get it on a subsample, as opposed to trying to deal with missing not at random. It's depending upon the details, it seems plausible to go down any of those paths, and it would just be, we would just need to have that conversation, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. So I would note that there are no open questions. I do have one quick question of my own, if you allow me. So you spoke about the missingness not at random MNAR mechanism, which is dependent on value, and provided a clever, elegant solution for that in the double sampling approach. The other way MNAR may be manifesting would be potentially when you are thinking about missing data in confounders or covariate type of information. And if this information is kind of being conflated with unmeasured confounding. So, in some cases, especially in settings that are typical to Sentinel, for example, comparing one drug versus another drug, or two different types of medications or approaches, where you have some unmeasured confounding going on, that's not only impacting treatment choice, but also impacting how measurements are done on various approaches, various confounders. And so I was wondering if your team has faced any of these issues or have been thinking about these, where MNAR is really dependent on like unmeasured confounding or confounding structures.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say the great thing about the example that you just gave is that you put a lot of thought into the mechanism. You're saying, oh, we've got missing not at random, and this is how I believe it's manifesting. And you've identified these confounders that are like, oh, these are things that I wish I had, you know. These other things that you wish you had, because then if you knew those things, you'd be able to either assess missing not at random or it wouldn't arise at all. And so those things that you wish you had that you don't have, that's where, if you can do the double sampling, you go get it. You know, you've done the work to say, these are the things I wish I had. And basically, anytime you say, I wish I had this, you can try to go down the path of double sampling. Sometimes it'll work and other times it won't.
Okay, yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for, again, a really excellent talk, a great summary of your work, which is relevant to so many of us. So thank you for taking the time today, and thank you to all the attendees who took the time to attend this, and I will see you around next time, hopefully.
All right, thank you.
Great.